The moment Clara Whitfield stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she told herself the same lie she had been telling for 11 months, that she could outrun what had happened in St. Louis, that the prairie wind would scrub her clean, that nobody out here would ever know her name well enough to ruin it. She was 22 years old, carrying a single leather traveling bag and wearing her best dress, which was not very good at all. The hem had been let down twice, the collar repaired with thread that did not quite match, and the color, a deep green that had once been lovely, had faded to something closer to the gray of old river water. She stood on the unpacked dirt of Caldwell's main street and breathed in the smell of horses and dust and something frying in the saloon across the way, and she thought, this will do. This will have to do. Caldwell was a cattle town, one of the last great shipping points on the Kishom Trail, and in 1882 it was still alive with the noise of that industry, the bawling of longhorns being driven through to the stockyards, the crack of drovers' whips, the laughter and arguments that spilled out of the saloons like water from a too-full bucket. It was not a gentle place, but Clara had not come looking for gentle. She had come looking for invisible, and a town this loud and busy seemed like as good a place as any to disappear into the machinery of ordinary life. She had secured herself a position through a letter of correspondence, a job as a seamstress and alterations woman for a dry goods merchant named Harold Greer, who had advertised in the St. Louis Dispatch for a skilled needlewoman willing to relocate. She had answered honestly about her skills, which were genuine, and dishonestly about nearly everything else which was necessary. She had not mentioned the baby. She had not mentioned the man who had fathered it, or the fact that her own family, her father, Edmund Whitfield, a respected deacon in the First Presbyterian Church of St. Louis, and her mother, Agnes, who played organ on Sundays and organized charity baskets for the poor, had told her she was no longer their daughter the night they found out. She had not mentioned any of that. She had signed the letter Clara Weston, her mother's maiden name, and she had prayed to a God she was no longer certain was listening that Harold Greer would not look too carefully at the references she had fabricated. He did not. He was a round-faced, distracted man in his mid-50s, who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the demands of his establishment, and enormously relieved that someone competent had arrived to handle the mending and alterations that had piled up in a back room for 3 months. He showed her the small room above the store where she would live, barely larger than a generous closet, with a window that looked out over the alley, and he told her the pay was $4 a week plus the room, and Clara said that was fine, and it was settled just like that. She unpacked her bag that first evening with the careful slowness of someone who is trying to make the act of unpacking feel permanent. She hung her spare dress on the hook behind the door. She set her sewing kit on the small table beside the narrow bed. She placed a single framed photograph face down in the bottom drawer of the small dresser because she could not yet decide whether to look at it or not. The photograph was of her son. His name was William, and he was 7 months old, and he was being raised by a Methodist minister and his wife in Springfield, Missouri, because Clara had signed papers giving him over before she fully understood what signing those papers would feel like afterward. She had understood the logic of it at the time. She had no money, no husband, no family willing to help, no way to provide for a child and remain employed and housed. The minister's wife had kind eyes and soft hands. She had told herself all of this, carefully and repeatedly, like a woman memorizing a recipe she does not want to forget. But there were nights when the logic dissolved entirely, and all that was left was the weight of what she had done, pressing on her chest like a stone. That was the secret. Not just that she had been with a man outside of marriage, though in 1882 Kansas, that alone was enough to end a woman's reputation entirely, but that she had given the resulting child away and walked out into the world afterward, still breathing, still functioning, still pretending she was simply a seamstress named Clara Weston who had come west for a fresh start. The shame of it was not simple. It was layered and contradictory. She was ashamed of what her parents thought of her, and she was ashamed of herself for caring what they thought. She was ashamed of the man who had promised her marriage and disappeared when she told him she was carrying his child, and she was ashamed that she had trusted him. She was ashamed of the moment she had placed William in the arms of a woman she barely knew, and she was ashamed of the relief she had felt afterward, which she considered the worst thing about herself, and the thing she thought about most in the dark. She was also, on good days, fiercely, quietly determined to survive all of it. The good days started winning more often once she settled into work. She had real skill with a needle and thread. Her mother had taught her that much, at least, the domestic arts having been considered the core of a proper upbringing. And word spread through Caldwell quickly that the seamstress at Greer's could perform miracles on a worn garment. Women brought her dresses to be resized, cuffs to be turned, hems to be taken in or let out. She worked with the focused attention of someone who needed her hands occupied, and the work repaid her with a kind of peace she could not find any other way. She had been in Caldwell about 3 weeks when she first saw Eli Brand. He came into the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning, trailing the particular smell of a man who had been on the trail for several weeks, horses and wood smoke and sun-heated leather. And he stood at the counter talking to Harold Greer about a supply order for a ranch he ran about 12 miles east of town. Clara was in the back room, door open, working on a dress belonging to the wife of the town's Methodist preacher, and she could hear the conversation without particularly trying to. He had a low, unhurried voice, the kind that did not rise or fall much, that stayed level in the way of someone who was not trying to impress anyone. He asked clear questions and waited for complete answers. When Harold fumbled through his order book and took too long, Eli did not sigh or tap the counter. He simply waited. Clara found herself slowing down her stitching to listen, which annoyed her, so she deliberately sped back up. She did not see his face that first time. She only heard the voice and the quiet knock of his boots on the floorboard when he turned to leave, and Harold saying, "She is in the back if you need alterations done, Brand. Best needlewoman I have had in 10 years. There was a pause, and then Eli Brand said, "I might take you up on that. I have got a jacket that needs repair. I will bring it in next week." And then the door opened and closed, and he was gone. She told herself she had not been listening. He came back the following Tuesday, exactly as he had said he would, which she noted without meaning to. He pushed the back room door open gently and knocked on the frame before stepping in, even though the door was already open, which she also noted. He was 30 years old, lean and straight-backed, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that the sun and wind had worked on steadily, leaving it weathered and honest-looking. His eyes were a shade of brown that was almost amber, and they moved around the room with the careful habit of someone who spent a lot of time in open country and had learned to read a space quickly. He held out the jacket, which had a badly torn seam along the left shoulder and a loose button on the cuff, and he said, "Harold said you could fix this. I appreciate it if you can." Clara took the jacket and examined the damage with the professional detachment she had cultivated. "It will take 2 days," she said. "The shoulder seam needs to be completely redone. The lining is coming away from the shell as well, you may not have noticed." He looked at it. "I had not noticed," he said. "Is it worth fixing, or should I just get a new one?" "It is worth fixing. The wool is good quality and the cut is sound. Someone made this jacket to last." She set it down on her work table. 50 cents for the whole repair. He nodded and put 50 cents on the table without haggling, which struck her as unusual in a town where haggling over price was considered practically a form of social greeting. "I am Eli Brand," he said. "I run the Anchor Brand ranch east of town." "I know," she said. "Harold mentioned it." He looked at her for a moment with that quiet, direct gaze. "And you are?" "Clara Weston," she said, and the false name came out easy and smooth, the way it always did now, the way a pebble worn smooth by water fits perfectly in the hand. "Miss Weston," he said, and nodded and left. The jacket took her a day and a half. She was more careful with it than she needed to be, restitching the shoulder seam with double rows and taking the time to secure the lining properly throughout, not just at the points of obvious failure. When he came to collect it on Thursday and examine the work, he turned it over in his hands with a kind of serious attention that she recognized as genuine appreciation for craft. "This is excellent work," he said. "I told you the jacket was worth saving," she said. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile yet, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that suggested smiling was something it knew how to do. "You did," he said. He put on the jacket and tested the shoulder seam by rolling his arm in a full circle, the way you would when preparing to rope a steer, and the seam held perfectly. "I will tell people," he said, "if that is all right, about your work." "That would be very much all right," Clara said. He began coming into town once a week, sometimes more, on ranch business, and he developed a habit of stopping in at the dry goods store even when he did not have anything in particular to order. He would talk to Harold for a few minutes, and then he would appear in the doorway of the back room and say something simple and direct. How was business? Had it been hot? Had she heard the thunderstorm 2 nights ago? And Clara would answer in the same simple, direct way. And these conversations lasted usually 5 or 10 minutes and felt, to Clara, like small gifts that she turned over later in the privacy of her room. She did not allow herself to think too much about why they felt that way. The social world of Caldwell in 1882 was a complicated thing. The town existed on a rough border between civilization and wildness, and the people in it were sorted accordingly. The settlers and merchants and their families who were building something permanent, the cowboys and drovers who were passing through, and the various people who existed in between those categories, navigating the space as best they could. Clara fell into an ambiguous position. She was a working woman, which gave her some respectability. She was single and without family connections in the territory, which gave her very little. She was quiet and competent and kept to herself, which people generally respected, but it also made her somewhat mysterious, and in a small town, mystery had a way of turning into suspicion if you were not careful. She was careful. She attended the Methodist church on Sundays, which Harold Greer had gently suggested was expected of his employees. She greeted people pleasantly and did excellent work and did not give anyone occasion to find fault with her conduct. She paid her debts promptly, and she did not drink, and she did not frequent the saloons, not that she had any particular desire to. She built herself a small, careful life inside the town's structures, the way you might build a shelter from available materials, not because the materials are perfect, but because they are what you have. She had made one friend, a genuine one, by midsummer. Her name was Ruth Calloway, a woman of 25 who ran the post office counter at the general store 2 buildings down from Greer's. Ruth was quick and funny and possessed of a sharp intelligence she did not bother to disguise, which Clara found refreshing after years of being told that intelligence in a woman was best kept quiet. Ruth had grown up in Caldwell, her father having been one of the early settlers, and she knew everyone in town and several things about each of them that she was usually too kind to mention. Ruth had an opinion about Eli Brand, which she shared one August afternoon while she and Clara were eating lunch on the wooden bench outside Greer's, watching the street. "He comes in here more than he needs to," Ruth said, without any particular preamble. For a man who runs a ranch and has more than enough to keep him occupied, Eli Brand finds a remarkable number of reasons to be on this end of Main Street. Clara kept her eyes on the street. "He has supply orders," she said. "He has a foreman named Pete Dawes who handles supply orders for most ranchers of that size," Ruth said pleasantly. "He could send Pete. He does not." Clara did not say anything. "He watched you walk past the post office window last Thursday," Ruth continued, "for long enough that I thought I was going to have to go tap him on the shoulder and remind him that the sun does not actually revolve around you, delightful as you are." "You are making that up," Clara said. "I am absolutely not," Ruth said. I have known Eli Brand for most of my life, and I have never once seen him watch anyone the way he watches you." Clara felt something move in her chest that she had no particular name for, something that was not entirely unwelcome and was therefore alarming. "He is simply being polite," she said firmly. "Clara," Ruth said, with a gentleness that made it worse, "the man brought his ranch hands mending in last week. Ranch hands do not get their mending done at a seamstress shop. They mend their own clothes or they do not mend them. He is finding reasons." Clara picked up her sandwich and took a bite and chewed it and swallowed it and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "It does not matter if he is finding reasons. There are things about me that would end any reason entirely, and that is simply the truth of my situation." Ruth looked at her for a moment with the careful attention of a woman who knew there was more underneath that sentence but had too much kindness to dig for it. "I will not push," she said, "but I will say that not every reason has to end before it has a chance to begin." Clara appreciated that she did not push. She also spent more time than she intended that evening thinking about what Ruth had said. The thing that surprised her about Eli Brand as the weeks accumulated into months was the quality of his attention. He did not talk at her, the way some men did. He talked with her, and more importantly, he listened with the same focused patience he seemed to bring to everything. He asked about her work with genuine curiosity. What made a particular fabric difficult to work with? How you determined the right technique for a particular type of seam? Whether she had learned her trade from someone or taught herself. He remembered what she said. The following week, he would refer back to something from the previous conversation, building on it the way you build on familiar ground. And Clara found this both charming and quietly devastating, because she was not accustomed to being remembered. He told her things in return, gradually, and without making a production of it. He had come to Kansas from Virginia at 23, after his parents died within a year of each other, and there was nothing left for him there. He had worked as a cowhand on 3 different outfits, learning the cattle business from the ground up, saving money with the kind of committed frugality that came from having a goal clearly in mind. He had bought his first piece of land 6 years ago, a small parcel that he had steadily expanded through work and careful dealing. And the Anchor Brand Ranch now ran 400 head of cattle and employed 7 hands, which was a solid operation by any measure. He had never married. He mentioned once, without particular emphasis, the way you mention a fact rather than an explanation. He had thought about it once years ago, but the woman had chosen someone else, and he said this without bitterness, just with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of a man who had processed something and set it down and kept walking. By September, he was coming by twice a week and staying longer, sometimes an hour, leaning against the doorframe of the back room while Clara worked, their conversation wandering freely across whatever territory it felt like covering that day. The cattle drives, the weather, the nature of the Kansas plains in autumn books, which he read more than she had expected. The question of whether Caldwell's days as a cattle town were numbered now that the railheads were moving further south and west. He made her laugh, which she had not expected. He had a dry, quiet sense of humor, delivered without setup or fanfare, and it ambushed her regularly. She would be in the middle of a sentence and he would say something low and precise, and she would laugh before she had time to decide whether to. And the laugh would come out real and unguarded, and she would feel briefly, completely like herself, her actual self, not the careful, constructed version she presented to the world. She told herself, through all of September and into October, that this was simply a pleasant friendship, that it did not need to become anything else, that given her circumstances it would be irresponsible to allow it to develop into anything more complicated. She made this argument to herself repeatedly and with considerable conviction, and it was making reasonable progress until the afternoon in mid-October when Eli brought her a jar of wild plum, preserves his housekeeper had made, left it on her work table without announcement while she was in the front of the store with a customer, And when she found it, there was a small piece of paper underneath that said, in handwriting that was careful without being fussy, "I thought you might like something sweet." E.B. She stood there holding the jar for an unreasonably long time. She told herself firmly that a jar of preserves was nothing. People gave each other jars of preserves. It was a completely ordinary gesture. She put it on the shelf above her work table and looked at it for the rest of the afternoon, and that evening opened it and tasted a spoonful and thought it was the best thing she had eaten in months, and then sat down on her bed and put her face in her hands for a while. The problem was not that she did not want whatever this was becoming. The problem was that she did want it, and wanting it meant risking it, and risking it meant, at some point, telling the truth. And the truth was the one thing she had crossed half the country to get away from. She thought about William. She thought about him most days, in a steady, low-grade way that had become part of the texture of her existence, like the ache in your hands after a long day of close work. She had sent one letter to the minister's wife in Springfield, 6 weeks after she had settled in Caldwell, asking simply that they let her know he was well. The reply had come 3 weeks later, a short, kind note saying that William was healthy and happy, and that they loved him as their own, and Clara had read that letter so many times the paper had worn soft along the fold lines. She did not know what to do with her feelings about William. The grief of losing him or giving him up, she was never sure which word was accurate, existed alongside the knowledge that she had made the best decision she could make with what she had at the time, and those two things did not cancel each other out. They simply both existed, like two rivers running parallel that did not merge. But if Eli Brand were to become something real, something lasting, then he would need to know. Not because she believed he had any automatic claim on her history. She understood, in the rational part of her mind, that her past was her own, but because she could not build something honest on a foundation of omission. She was not willing to do that. She had enough things she could not forgive herself for without adding deliberate deception of a good man to the list. She just needed to find the courage and the right moment, and she kept finding reasons why neither the courage nor the moment were quite present yet. The moment arrived before she was ready for it, as such moments tend to do. It was a Saturday in early November, and Caldwell was having one of its periodically rowdy evenings, a cattle drive having come through that week, and the hands having their pay and their freedom for the night. Clara had stayed late at the shop to finish a commission that was needed Monday, and she was walking back from returning a completed order to the banker's wife across town, when she heard her name spoken in a voice she recognized with a cold, dropping sensation in the pit of her stomach. The voice belonged to a man named Douglas Prout, who had been a neighbor of her family's in St. Louis, and who was, she now saw with absolute clarity, standing outside the Lone Star Saloon with 2 other men, looking at her with the particular expression of a person who has just found something they were not looking for but are very pleased to have found. Douglas Prout was 45 years old, prosperous, pompous, and the kind of man who considered other people's private disasters to be his own social currency. He had been one of the people her father had told, in the weeks after everything came out, because her father had told people, had apparently felt that containing the shame within the family was less important than preemptively managing the narrative with their social circle. Douglas Prout had known everything. "Clara Whitfield," he said, louder than necessary, covering the few feet between them with the confident movement of someone who expects the world to arrange itself around him. "Or perhaps you are going by something else these days. I heard you left St. Louis." Clara stopped. She had approximately 3 seconds to decide how to handle this, and she used all 3 of them. "Mr. Prout," she said, keeping her voice level, "I did not know you had come west." "Business interests," he said, waving a hand. "Cattle investment. I am here for the week." He looked at her with that expression, that knowing, slightly delighted expression that she recognized as the face of someone about to do something that would benefit no one but himself. Your family has been worried about you, I am sure. Edmund did not know where you had gone. I am well, she said. Good evening, Mr. Root. She tried to walk past him and he stepped slightly, not quite blocking her but making his presence felt in a way that required her to acknowledge it. I did hear, he said, lowering his voice to the confidential register that was somehow worse than the loud one, about the trouble, the whole situation. Your father was devastated naturally, and then the child, well, these things happen, I suppose, though not to everyone. Clara felt the blood leave her face and then return with considerable force. She was aware that there were people on the street, people who might be close enough to hear, people who knew her face if not yet her name. That is a private matter, she said, and her voice was very steady and she was quite proud of it. Of course, Prout said, in the tone of a man who had no intention of treating it that way. Although in a town this size, I imagine things tend to come out. Things always come out, Clara. It is simply the nature of Mr. Prout. This was a new voice, and it came from behind Clara, and she turned to find Eli Brand standing a few yards back on the sidewalk, clearly having come from the direction of the feed store, carrying a small sack, looking at Douglas Prout with the calm, level attention he brought to everything, though tonight there was something underneath the calm that Clara had not seen in him before. Is there a problem here? Prout looked at him with the assessing expression of a man who had not expected an interruption. And who are you? I am Eli Brand, he said. He did not say anything else to explain himself or justify his presence. He simply said his name and held Prout's gaze. Prout took in the direct quality of that gaze and something shifted in his assessment. This is a private conversation, he said. It did not appear entirely private, Eli said. Miss Weston, are you all right? Clara looked at him. His eyes moved to her face with a brief, quiet inquiry, and she felt something in her chest that she could not afford to think about at this particular moment. I am fine, she said. Mr. Prout was just leaving. Prout looked between them with the sharp eyes of a man revising his calculations. I was simply greeting an old acquaintance, he said, with an unpleasant smile. But perhaps we will talk again, Clara. I am in town through Thursday. He went back into the saloon and the door swung shut behind him and Clara stood on the sidewalk in the November night air and breathed carefully. Old acquaintance, Eli said. A neighbor of my family's, she said. In St. Louis, she paused. He is not a kind man. Eli looked at the closed saloon door and then back at her. He was making you uncomfortable. Yes, she said simply. He stood there for a moment, not pressing, not filling the space with unnecessary words. Then he said, will you let me walk you back to Greer's? She looked at him. In the thin light from the windows of the buildings around them, his face was steady and undemanding, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she had not been truly frightened by Prout because Eli had been standing behind her, which was an alarming thing to realize because she had not known he was there, and yet the moment she saw him she had felt the fear recede. Yes, she said. Thank you. They walked the 2 blocks back to Greer's mostly in silence, and it was the comfortable kind, the kind that had developed between them over months of conversation, where silence was simply the breath between words rather than an absence of connection. At the door she turned to say good night and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something careful and considered, as though he were deciding whether to say something. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it landed differently than her name usually did. If that man says anything to cause you trouble, I want you to tell me. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said, not challengingly, but genuinely, because she wanted to understand what he meant by it. He seemed to think about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because you are someone worth looking out for, he said, and there are not enough people doing it. She went upstairs and did not sleep for a very long time. Douglas Prout did not leave Caldwell on Thursday as he had implied. He stayed through the weekend, and on Sunday morning, as Clara was walking to church, he materialized beside her on the street with the particular persistence of someone who has decided that a thing is going to happen regardless of the other person's wishes. I have been thinking, he said, falling into step beside her. "About your situation." "I was not aware my situation required your thinking," Clara said. "Your father is a proud man," Prout continued, ignoring this. "He has not told people exactly what happened, but he has been unable to keep it entirely quiet. There are those in St. Louis who know that you left under circumstances. Those circumstances will follow you, Clara. They always do." "Is there something you want, Mr. Prout?" she said. "Because if you are simply here to remind me of things I am already aware of, I would respectfully suggest your time could be better spent." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and there was something in his face now that was less the social cruelty she had thought she was dealing with, and more something heavier and more deliberate. "I want nothing," he said. "I am simply warning you. This cowboy you seem to have attached yourself to Brand, whatever his name is, when he finds out what you are and what you did, he will not want you either. You might consider whether there is an honest conversation to be had before he hears it somewhere less charitable." She stood very still. "You would not," she said. His expression told her that he absolutely would. She went to church and sat in the pew and heard not a word of the sermon. By the time she walked back to Greer's afterward, her mind was completely made up. Not because Prout had threatened her, though he had. Not because she was afraid of being exposed, though she was. But because she had spent the last 2 months allowing herself to care about Eli Brand, and she was not going to let him hear her truth from a man who would dress it up in the language of scandal and shame. If it was going to come out, and it was, she understood now with perfect clarity, it was going to come out. Then it was going to come from her, in her own words, and she was going to look him in the eye when she said it. She sent a note to the Anchor Brand ranch on Monday morning, asking Eli if he could come by the shop on his next trip to town. He arrived Tuesday, as she had known he would. He came through the back room door with his usual knock on the frame, and she was sitting at her work table not pretending to work because she was too anxious for pretending, and she said, "Sit down, please," which came out more formal than she intended, and he looked at her face and sat down in the chair across from the work table without asking any questions. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment and then looked up at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I want you to let me tell it all the way through before you say anything, because if you interrupt me, I will lose my nerve, and I cannot afford to lose my nerve right now." "All right," he said. "My name is not Clara Weston," she said. "It is Clara Whitfield. I am from St. Louis. My father is a deacon in the Presbyterian church there." She paused. 2 years ago I was involved with a man named James Coulter who was a junior partner at my father's law firm. He told me he intended to marry me. I believed him because I was young and I was foolish and he was convincing. When I told him I was going to have his child, he left St. Louis within the week. He did not leave an address. She watched Eli's face. It did not change, not in any way that moved toward judgment. He was simply listening. "My parents," she continued, and her voice did not shake, which she was grateful for, "were not able to accept it. My father is a man of particular views about propriety and reputation. He told me that I had brought shame on the family and that I could not remain under his roof. My mother agreed with him. I had nowhere to go and no income, and I was 5 months along by then." She paused again. "I stayed with a cousin for 2 months while I tried to determine what I could do. After the baby was born, I signed papers transferring care to a Methodist minister and his wife in Springfield. The baby, the boy, was healthy. He went to people who could provide for him properly. I could not. The room was very quiet. She could hear the street outside, a wagon passing, someone's dog. I came to Caldwell because I needed to disappear," she said. "I needed to start somewhere no one knew me. I gave myself my mother's maiden name and I answered Harold's advertisement, and I told myself that nobody out here needed to know any of this." She looked at Eli steadily. "But there is a man in town named Douglas Prout who knew my family in St. Louis and who knows what happened, and he intends to make sure you hear about it one way or another. So I decided you would hear it from me instead." She stopped. The silence stretched. He was looking at her with that amber-dark gaze that she had learned over months of his company, gave away more than most people's faces did if you knew where to look. She could see him processing, could see the quality of his attention, which was not shocked or disgusted. It was something more complicated and more careful than that. "The baby is well," he said. "The boy is in good health." Of all the things she had expected him to say first, it was not that. She blinked. "Yes," she said. "The minister's wife writes, he is healthy." Eli nodded slowly. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked back up at her. "The man who left," he said. "Sir? I have not heard from him or of him since," she said. "Nor do I want to." Eli nodded again. He was quiet for another moment, and Clara sat very still, holding herself in the steady, careful way of someone who has said the necessary thing and is now waiting for the consequence, whatever it is. "Clara," he said, and there was that weight in her name again, the weight she had noticed the first time he used it. "What you did with William, was that what you chose, or what you were forced into?" She thought about this honestly. "Both," she said. "I was forced by circumstances, but I made the choice. I will not pretend otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is the most honest answer anyone has given me in a very long time," he said. She waited. "I am not a man who measures a person by the worst thing that was done to them," he said, "or by the hardest decision they ever had to make. I am sorry that the man left. I am sorry that your family failed you. I am sorry you have been carrying this alone." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was very quiet. "Your past stops here," he said. "I mean that. Whatever you have been afraid I would think or do when I found out, you can put that down. It does not change what I know of you, and what I know of you is considerable." Clara stared at him. She had prepared herself for many possible responses. She had not prepared herself for this one. "You cannot simply decide that," she said, and her voice was not as steady as it had been. "These things have consequences. People will talk. Prut will. Let Prut talk," Eli said, with a flat certainty that was not aggressive but was completely final. "I have lived in this territory for 7 years, and I have built something real here, and people in this county know what I am. If Douglas Prut wants to spend his time in Caldwell spreading stories about a woman who survived something difficult and kept going, then he is going to find that nobody pays him much attention." He paused. "And if they do pay him attention, then that tells us something useful about them." Clara felt something crack open somewhere in the middle of her chest. It was not painful exactly. It was the feeling of a thing that has been held very tightly for a very long time being gently released, and the release itself was almost overwhelming in its intensity. She put her hands flat on the work table and breathed. "Why?" she asked, and it was the same question she had asked him on the sidewalk that first night, genuine and direct. "Why does it not change how you see me?" He looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded, which she had not seen from him before, and it struck her like a physical thing. "Because," he said carefully, "the woman I have spent the last 2 months talking to, the woman who looks at every piece of work like it matters, who laughs when she is surprised into it, who treats every person who walks through that door like they are worth taking seriously, that is who you are. What happened in St. Louis is part of your life. It is not the whole of it, and it is sure as anything not the part of it that I have been thinking about." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "What part have you been thinking about?" And there it was, that almost smile, finally arriving completely. It changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and considerably less serious, and exactly like the sort of person you would walk 12 miles to see. "The part," he said, "where I have been running out of excuses to come into town twice a week, and I am going to need to think of better ones if you do not let me take you to supper on Saturday." Despite everything, despite the trembling that had started somewhere in her hands, despite the stinging at the back of her eyes that she was absolutely not going to give in to, she laughed. "The real one, the unguarded one. You could simply say you would like to take me to supper," she said. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "would you like to have supper with me on Saturday?" "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." Douglas Prut made one more attempt, on Wednesday evening, cornering Ruth Calloway in the post office, and telling her the full story of Clara's history in St. Louis. clearly expecting Ruth to spread it through the town's gossip network with the efficiency that networks of that kind usually operated at. Ruth listened to the entire account and then said with perfect composure, "Mr. Pruitt, is there something I can help you with at the post office counter today? Because if not, I believe my lunch hour is just about to start." When Pruitt had gone, Ruth went directly to Clara and relayed the conversation with the faithful accuracy of a court reporter, and then she said, "For what it is worth, the only person I have heard express any opinion about you whatsoever is Eli Brand, and his opinion of you is so thoroughly positive that listening to it is almost embarrassing for both of you." "He told you his opinion," Clara said. "He did not have to," Ruth said. "Clara, the man's entire face changes when someone says your name in his presence. It is not subtle." Pruitt left Caldwell on Friday morning. Later, Clara would learn that he had gone to 2 or 3 other people in town with what he knew. But the effect he had hoped for did not materialize, partly because of the respect Eli Brand commanded in the county, and partly because the people of Caldwell, whatever their flaws, were generally more interested in what a person was doing now than in what they had survived before. The story circulated at the edges of the social world for a week or two and then died down, replaced by other, fresher gossip about other people's business. What stayed was the supper on Saturday, which was at the hotel dining room, which was the nicest restaurant Caldwell offered, and where Eli arrived in a clean shirt and his repaired jacket looking like a man who had thought carefully about the evening. They had roast chicken and cornbread and apple pie, and they talked for 3 hours, and it was different from the conversations in the back room, not in substance but in transparency, because both of them had laid down what they were carrying, and there was a lightness to the air between them that had not been there before. He reached across the table at one point and covered her hand with his, not dramatically, just the quiet placement of his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and neither of them said anything about it. They simply went on talking, but something had shifted irrevocably and both of them knew it. He kissed her for the first time at the end of that evening, on the steps of Greer's, under a sky that was absolutely packed with stars the way the Kansas sky could be when it decided to be, and it was very gentle and very certain at the same time, which was exactly the way he did most things, and Clara stood on the second step with her heart beating considerably faster than usual and thought that she had crossed half the country and she had been right. She had been exactly right. This would do. This would do beautifully. They moved toward each other with the unhurried certainty of people who have decided and do not need to rush. He came to town twice a week through November and into December, and on the nights he stayed in town rather than riding back in the dark. He took his supper at the hotel and walked her home afterward, and they stood on the steps and talked past the point when the cold made it sensible, their breath visible in the winter air, neither of them willing to say good night until it was absolutely necessary. He introduced her to his foreman, Pete Dawes, who shook her hand with the particular seriousness of a man who has been working closely with someone for years and has taken it upon himself to evaluate their important decisions. Pete was 52, weathered and bow-legged and extremely direct, and he looked at Clara for a moment and then looked at Eli and said, "Well, better than I expected you to manage," which Eli later assured her was a very high compliment. She visited the Anchor Brand ranch for the first time in December, riding out in the wagon with Eli on a Sunday after church, and she saw what he had built, a solid, well-maintained house of limestone and wood, a barn that was organized with the same careful practicality he brought to everything, corrals full of healthy cattle, a bunkhouse where his hands lived. The housekeeper, a stout and formidable woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who had been cooking and cleaning for Eli since his second year on the property, received Clara with a scrutiny that was barely disguised, and then made her the best coffee she had ever tasted, which Clara took as approval. She stood at the window of the front room, looking out at the winter-pale grassland rolling away in every direction, the sky enormous above it, and felt something very still and very good settling inside her. She did not say this to Eli, because it seemed too large a thing to say out loud yet. But he was standing behind her and looking at the same view, and she thought from the quality of the silence that he felt it too. He asked her to marry him in February, on a Thursday evening, in the back room of Greer's Dry Goods, which was where everything important between them had happened, and so was exactly the right place. He had no ring to give her yet. He said he would have one made in Wichita if she said yes. But he wanted to ask now because he had been thinking of little else for the past 6 weeks, and he did not see any reason to wait further. She had been stitching a buttonhole, and she set it down and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, which was the only indication that he was not entirely as calm as he appeared, because she had noticed over the months that he turned his hat in his hands when he was doing something that mattered to him. "You know everything," she said, not as a question. "I know everything," he agreed. "And I am asking you anyway, which is how I would like you to understand the quality of the asking." She stood up from her stool. "Yes," she said, and the word came out with a warmth and a completeness that surprised even her. "Eli Brand, yes." He crossed the room and took her hands in his, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady, and she loved him enormously in that moment for the trembling that he could not hide. He kissed her, and it was different from the careful, beginning kisses of the fall. It was the kiss of a man who has been given something he was not entirely sure he deserved, and is holding it with both hands. They were married in April 1883, at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, on a morning when the Kansas spring was performing at its best. The sky an extravagant blue, the prairie greening up at the edges, the cottonwood trees along the creek putting out their new leaves. Ruth Calloway stood up with Clara as her witness, wearing a yellow dress that she said she had been saving for an occasion worth wearing it to. Pete Dawes stood with Eli, having taken the role with the same serious competence he brought to all of his responsibilities, including having cleaned his boots to a shine that Clara gathered was unprecedented. Harold Greer sat in the third pew and wept openly, which surprised everyone including Harold. The ring Eli had made in Wichita was a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, the color of red earth, and Clara wore it with the feeling of something finally, permanently placed. They drove out to the ranch together that afternoon in the wagon, with the late April light stretching long across the grassland, and Eli's hand was on the seat between them and Clara's hand was over it, and they did not need to say very much at all. Mrs. Hargrove had prepared a supper that was clearly intended to establish early and firmly that the kitchen was still her domain, which Clara respected entirely. They ate together at the kitchen table while the spring evening came down outside, and after supper Clara stood at the basin washing up and Eli came and stood beside her and took over the drying, and they did this ordinary domestic task together in complete comfort, the way people do when they have found the person they belong next to. The first months of their marriage were the kind of months that people often describe as the best of their lives, not because nothing difficult happened, but because the ordinary fabric of days was so consistently good that even the difficult things, a late spring storm that took down part of the barn roof, a cattle illness that cost them a dozen head, a tense week when a land dispute with a neighboring rancher required careful legal negotiation felt manageable, because they were managing them together. Clara continued her work for Harold Greer part-time through the summer, traveling into town with Eli on his supply runs. She had told Harold the truth about her name the week after she accepted Eli's proposal, sitting across the desk from him and explaining herself plainly, and Harold had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Miss Whitfield, or Mrs. Brand as you will soon be, your work is the best I have seen. Your character is beyond question as far as I am concerned, and if you can continue the alterations business from the ranch by accepting orders and returning them on Eli's supply trips, that would suit me just fine." She had been so relieved she had shaken his hand 3 times. She wrote to the minister's wife in Springfield again in June. She had been putting this off for reasons she was only partly willing to examine, but Eli had said one evening, gently and without pressure, that she might feel better if the correspondence were regular, and he was right. She wrote that she was married now, that she was settled on a good ranch in Caldwell County, that she hoped William was well and growing, and that if it was not too much to ask, she would be grateful for news of him whenever the minister's wife had occasion to write. She signed it Clara Brand, and sending the letter with her new name on it felt like something significant. The reply came in August. It was 3 pages long, filled with detailed descriptions of a 1-year-old boy who was apparently walking already, and had opinions about everything and laughed constantly, and had dark hair like his mother. The minister's wife included a small pencil sketch someone had done of him, rough but recognizable, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands for a long time. Eli came in from the barn and found her there, and he sat down across from her without asking questions, and after a moment she handed him the letter. He read it carefully, all 3 pages. Then he looked at the sketch for a while. "He looks like you," he said. "You cannot possibly tell that from a pencil sketch," she said. "I can tell," he said. He set the letter down and looked at her steadily. "How are you?" She considered the question honestly. "I am glad he is well," she said, "and I am glad he has people who love him, and there is still a part of me that—" She stopped. "That grieves," he said. "Yes," she said, "that always." He reached across the table and took her hand. "That is the right thing to feel," he said. "That means you loved him. And you still do. There is nothing wrong with that." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the August morning light. This man who did not flinch from the difficult thing, who said the right words not because they were comfortable but because they were true, and she thought that she had not known, before him, that love could feel like this, like being completely known and completely wanted in the same moment. She had thought those 2 things could not coexist. She had been entirely wrong. "I love you," she said, and it was not the first time she had said it, but it meant something slightly different every time, and this time it meant all of what she had just been thinking. "I love you," he said, in the same careful, certain way he said everything, as if he had thought about it and was fully committed to every syllable. The fall of 1883 brought a change that neither of them had been expecting quite so soon, though both of them were very glad of it. Clara realized in October that she was expecting a child, and she sat with the knowledge alone for several days, testing it against herself, finding that what she felt was something complicated and astonishing. Not the fear that had accompanied her first pregnancy, not the desperate aloneness of that time, but something much closer to hope, threaded through with a tenderness so acute it almost hurt. She told Eli on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the front porch watching the sun go down over the grassland, the sky doing its full autumn display of red and orange and deep violet, and she said very simply, "Eli, I am expecting." He was quiet for a moment that felt very full. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was joy, she decided, genuine and unguarded and enormous, but held carefully, the way he held things that mattered most. "When," he said, "late spring, I think," she said. "April, perhaps May." He reached out and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that while the sky went through its colors and eventually darkened to deep blue, and he pressed his lips to her temple and said quietly, "Clara, this is the best news I have had in my entire life." She laughed softly. "Your entire life," she said. "My entire life," he confirmed. The winter of 1883 to 1884 settled over the Kansas plains, with the particular severity that those plains were capable of. Heavy snowfalls and bitter cold in weeks when the sky was the color of old tin, and the wind drove ice crystals sideways across the open grassland. The ranch demanded constant attention in weather like this, breaking ice on the water troughs, moving cattle to better shelter, ensuring the hands in the bunkhouse had enough wood. Eli worked harder in those months than Clara had ever seen him work. coming in from the cold in the evenings with his face raw and his movements carrying the particular deliberateness of exhaustion. And she made sure there was hot food and warm coffee, and the particular domestic comfort that she had discovered she was genuinely good at and genuinely loved providing. Ruth Calloway came out to visit once a month through the winter, making the 12-mile trip with borrowed transport and sufficient layers, and these visits were among Clara's most cherished things. Ruth brought news from town, which was often amusing, and brought herself, which was always better. She sat at the kitchen table with Clara while Mrs. Hargrove made pointed efforts not to eavesdrop, and they talked about everything and nothing. And Ruth announced in January that she was being courted seriously by a lawyer who had set up practice in Caldwell in the fall, a man named Arthur Fielding from Ohio. And Clara was so pleased about this that she immediately demanded a full account of every conversation they had ever had, which took the better part of an afternoon. She also spent those winter months continuing to correspond with the minister's wife in Springfield, a correspondence that had become, by slow degrees, a genuine exchange of letters rather than a formal reporting of facts. She had learned that the minister's wife, whose name was Eleanor, had 5 children of her own in addition to William, that she grew prize-winning dahlias in her garden, that her husband was a gentle and learned man who was teaching William, now almost 2 years old, to name the animals in his picture books. Clara read these letters many times and wrote back carefully and honestly, not pretending that she had no pain in the exchange, but not pretending either that she was not grateful for it. She told Eli about the letters, all of them, and he read them when she offered them and asked questions and listened to her answers, and he never once suggested she should feel differently about any of it than she felt. He was, in this way as in others, the rarest kind of man, the kind who understood that a woman's interior life was her own, that his role was not to manage it but to stand beside it. Their son was born in May 1884, on a warm morning when the ranch was full of birdsong and the wildflowers on the prairie were at their most extravagant. Mrs. Hargrove, who had more experience with births than she had ever detailed, took charge of the practical management of the event with impressive authority, and Ruth had come out 3 days before, when it became clear things were close, and she stayed through it all, holding Clara's hand and making the specific sort of jokes that nobody who is not your closest friend would think to make at a moment like that, which helped considerably. Eli sat on the porch through most of the morning because Mrs. Hargrove had told him firmly that he was not needed inside, though she periodically sent Ruth out to give him updates so that he did not pace himself into a different county. Clara could hear, between the harder moments, the sound of him on the porch, his boots against the boards, and the sound was deeply steadying. The baby was delivered at 10:30 in the morning, healthy and emphatically vocal from the first moment, and Mrs. Hargrove brought him out to Eli wrapped in a square of clean flannel, and Clara, lying back against the pillow and feeling the particular exhausted elation of that time, listened to the silence that followed and then heard Eli say something low and quiet that she could not make out, but that had a quality to it that she understood perfectly. He came in a few minutes later, carrying the baby with the careful concentration of someone doing something unprecedented and important, and he sat down on the edge of the bed beside her and held the baby out so she could see his face round and red and fiercely present, with a cap of dark hair and Eli's amber-dark eyes, though she supposed she could not know for certain whose eyes they were yet. "Hello," Clara said to the baby, and her voice had a warmth in it that she had never heard from herself before, or perhaps she had heard it once years ago and then had had to put it away. "What do we name him?" Eli said, looking at the small face with an expression of complete wonder. She had thought about this for months. "Thomas," she said, "Thomas Edmund Brand." She had put her father's name in it, not because she had forgiven him. Forgiveness was a longer road and she was still walking it, but because she believed in the possibility of it, and giving a child a name was an act of looking forward. "Thomas Edmund Brand," Eli said, trying it out, looking satisfied. That is a good name. Thomas Edmund Brand grew at the speed that babies grow, which is to say terrifyingly fast and with complete disregard for anyone's readiness. And the months that followed his birth were full in the way that only the early days of parenthood can be, exhausting and magnificent, and often funny and occasionally difficult, and so deeply worth it that even the difficulty was a kind of gift. The ranch continued to grow as well. Eli expanded the herd that fall, acquiring additional grazing rights on a parcel to the east, and he hired 2 additional hands to manage the increased workload. He also built, in the spring of 1885, an addition to the house, 2 rooms on the eastern side, properly framed and finished, which gave them a proper bedroom, a study, and which moved Thomas's crib into a room that would eventually be his own. He built it himself, with Pete Dawes and the hands helping on the heavy work, and Clara watched this happen with the feeling that something she had built out of the air was becoming solid and real and permanent. She had one more thing she needed to do, one thread she had left open that she had been working toward for 2 years without quite reaching it. She wrote to her mother. Not to her father. That was a bridge she was not yet certain could be built, and she was not going to force it, but to her mother, Agnes Whitfield, who had stood beside her husband the night he told Clara to leave, and had not said a single word in her daughter's defense. Clara had thought about that night many times, had been angry about it in the way you can only be angry at a parent, fully and personally, and she had also, over time, come to understand something about her mother that did not excuse what she had done but made it explicable. Agnes Whitfield had been afraid. She had been afraid of her husband and afraid of her God and afraid of the social world she had built her life within, and she had sacrificed her daughter to those fears, and that was a terrible thing, and it was also a very human one. The letter was not easy to write. She went through 4 drafts over the course of 2 weeks. She sat at the desk in the new study on winter evenings while Thomas slept and Eli read nearby, and she wrote and crossed out and rewrote. Eli did not ask what she was writing, though he could see her working at it with the intensity she reserved for things that cost her something. One evening she handed him the 4th draft and asked him to read it, and he read it through without speaking and handed it back and said, "That is exactly right. Send that one." She sent it on a Thursday in March 1885. She sent it to the house on Mulberry Street in St. Louis, her mother's name on the envelope, and she did not expect an answer or tried not to. She told herself that the sending of it was the thing, not the response, and she mostly believed this. The answer came 6 weeks later, in a handwriting she had known since childhood, the careful, precise loops of a woman who had done her penmanship exercises thoroughly. Her mother had written 3 pages. The first page was stiff and formal, full of the language of propriety and regret, but by the second page something had cracked through the formality, and the 3rd page was almost entirely different in tone. A mother's voice, recognizable beneath all the accumulated damage of years, saying that she had thought of Clara every day, that she had prayed for her every Sunday, that she had been wrong to stay silent, and that if Clara could ever find it in her heart to write again, she would be very glad. There was nothing about Edmund Whitfield. He was not mentioned once in any of the 3 pages, and Clara chose to take that as information rather than an absence. She read the letter to Eli that evening after supper, and when she finished she was not crying, but it was close, and Eli said simply, "What do you want to do?" "I want to write back," she said, slowly, carefully. "I do not know where it goes from there, but I want to write back." "Then write back," he said, so she did. And the correspondence between Clara Brand and Agnes Whitfield continued from that spring forward, letters crossing the prairie and the Mississippi, building something gradual and fragile, and real out of the wreckage of something that had seemed permanent. It was Ruth who told Clara, in the summer of 1885, that Arthur Fielding had proposed, and that she had accepted. Ruth made the announcement on a visit to the ranch, pulling off her gloves on the porch and holding up her left hand, where a simple silver ring sat, with the expression of a woman who has been successfully keeping this secret for an entire week and deserves considerable credit for it. Clara embraced her so forcefully that Ruth staggered and said, laughing, "Careful, I am not a fence post." And Clara said, "I am going to make your dress. Do not even think about arguing with me." And Ruth said, "I was not going to argue at all." And they sat on the porch in the summer afternoon and talked about it for 3 hours while Thomas, who had recently become mobile and was exploring the world with the determination of a small explorer, moved systematically around their feet. The wedding was in September. Clara made the dress ivory cotton with a modest bustle and pearl buttons down the back, fitted precisely to Ruth's figure, which Clara knew after years of friendship and frequent measuring. She made it with the same serious attention she gave to all her best work, and when Ruth put it on the morning of the wedding and looked at herself in the mirror, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Clara," and could not quite finish the sentence, which Clara considered the best possible review. Eli sat in the church pew beside Clara with Thomas on his knee, and Thomas was remarkably well behaved for the ceremony until the very end, when he decided to comment on the proceedings in his own clear and enthusiastic way, causing a ripple of laughter through the congregation that the minister graciously absorbed into the final blessing. Eli caught him before he could make a break for the aisle, and Clara covered her mouth and tried to look appropriately solemn and failed completely. Walking out into the September sunshine afterward, Eli's hand at the small of her back, Thomas riding on his father's shoulder and patting Eli's hat with proprietary satisfaction, Clara thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell 3 years ago with a single leather traveling bag and a lie for a name, and she considered the distance between that woman and this moment, and it struck her as one of the larger distances she had ever crossed. Not measured in miles but in the harder currency of trust and time and honest labor on the interior. She had not found what she came west looking for, which was invisibility. She had found the opposite. She had been seen, completely and carefully, by a man who then chose her anyway, and it turned out that was an entirely better thing. That evening, after Thomas was in bed, she and Eli sat on the porch as they often did, in the particular companionable quiet that was one of her favorite things about her life, and the prairie was dark and enormous around them, and the sky was doing its extravagant star display, and she said, "Eli," he said, "I am glad you walked down Main Street that particular Tuesday," she said. He considered this. "So am I," he said. "I was terrified of you for weeks," she said. "Not of you exactly, of what you might find out." "I know," he said. "Did you know then?" "I knew you were carrying something," he said. "I did not know what, but I could see it." "And you stayed anyway," she said. "Clara," he said with the patient amusement of a man addressing an extremely obvious point, "I brought you plum preserves. That was not a casual gesture." She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the dark for a while. In the spring of 1886, 2 things happened that seemed unrelated but Clara held together in her mind as belonging to the same change in the current of things. The first was that she received a letter from Alina, the minister's wife in Springfield. William was now 3.5 years old and fully, exuberantly himself, Alina wrote. He loved horses above all other things, could spend an entire afternoon at the fence watching them pass, and had recently developed a passion for being read to and would not sleep until he had heard at least 3 stories. He had dark hair and dark eyes and a laugh that was, Alina wrote, simply contagious, and he was healthy and happy and so very loved. Clara read this letter at the kitchen table and Eli was there, and she did not hand it to him this time, but she read the important parts aloud, and when she read the part about the horses, she saw a smile break across his face. "That is from you," he said, though he could not possibly have known this for certain. "You are the one who stands at the corral fence for no reason every morning." "I have reasons," Clara said. "You have the same reason he does," Eli said. "You just like looking at them." She folded the letter carefully. She would write back tomorrow. She always wrote back. The second thing was that her mother came west. It was not planned, or rather it was not planned by Clara. Agnes Whitfield had written in February asking, with the elaborate careful formality she used when asking something important, whether she might visit. She was not young and the trip was long. She understood that, but she had never been west and she would so like to see how Clara lived, and whether there might be any possibility, if Clara was willing, of meeting her grandson. Clara had sat with this letter for a long time before answering. She had taken long walks along the edge of the property in the cold February air, working through what she felt about it. She had talked to Eli, who had said, without sentiment or pressure, that the decision was entirely hers and he would support whatever she chose, but that in his observation, people who had the chance to repair things and did not usually regretted it. She had written back and said yes. Agnes Whitfield arrived in Caldwell on the 1st of April, on the same afternoon stage from Wichita that Clara herself had arrived on nearly 4 years earlier, and she came down the steps of the stagecoach looking considerably smaller than Clara remembered her, smaller and older and slightly overwhelmed by the noise and the dust and the sheer unfenced expanse of the Kansas sky. And then she saw Clara standing in the street, and she stopped entirely. They looked at each other across the 10 feet of distance. Clara had spent a great deal of time anticipating this moment, considering what she would say or not say, what tone to strike, whether to be warm or careful or something in between. But when her mother stopped on the stagecoach steps and looked at her, all of that preparation dissolved, and what came instead was something very old and very simple, something that lived below the layer of hurt and anger, and she walked the 10 feet and held out her hands. Agnes Whitfield took her daughter's hands and then wrapped both arms around her, and she did not say anything for a long time. When she did speak, she said, against Clara's shoulder in the voice of an old woman who has been thinking about something for 3 years, "I am sorry. I am so very sorry." "I know," Clara said. "It was not the resolution of everything. It was the beginning of a resolution, which is different and which requires more patience and is ultimately more real." The week Agnes Whitfield spent on the Anchor Brand ranch was careful and sometimes difficult, and also, in moments, genuinely warm. She sat with Thomas in the afternoons and let him show her the horses through the corral fence with the devoted seriousness of a small host presenting his most important possessions. And the look on her face during these exhibitions was something Clara could not bear to examine too directly, because it involved too many things at once. She and her mother had one real conversation, on the 3rd evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while Eli had taken Thomas out to check on the horses with Pete Dawes. It was a long conversation that went to places neither of them had planned to go, that said things that had not been said because saying them would have required a structural honesty that had not been possible before. Clara said things about the night she had been told to leave that she had never said to anyone except Eli. Agnes Whitfield said things about the years of her marriage and the particular pressures of the life she had lived that did not excuse what had happened but illuminated it. And Clara listened carefully and found that understanding something and forgiving something were related but not the same thing, and that she was somewhere on the road between them. Edmund Whitfield was not mentioned. Not once in that whole conversation, and Clara took from this that some resolutions were not going to happen in any timeline she could currently see, and she chose to make peace with that. When Agnes left on the following Saturday, she embraced Clara in the street outside Greer's where the stage stopped, and she held her tightly and she said, "You have made a beautiful life." And it was the truest and most generous thing she had ever said to her daughter, and Clara received it as such. "I did," Clara said. "It took some doing, but I did." She watched the stage pull away down the main street of Caldwell and stood there until it turned east toward Wichita and was no longer visible. And then she turned around to find Eli behind her, Thomas on his hip, both of them watching her with the same steady, warm attention that was one of the great constants of her life. She walked back to them. She put her hand against Eli's face for a moment, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. And Thomas, sensing that something significant was happening and not wanting to be left out, grabbed a fistful of her hair. "Thomas," Eli said. "No," Thomas said agreeably, keeping the hair. She was laughing as she extracted herself, and the three of them walked down Main Street in the April sunshine, the town moving around them with its usual noise and energy, the cattle country going about its business in the particular flavor of a year when the drives were still coming, and Caldwell was still very much alive with its purpose. The summer of 1886 was a good one. The ranch prospered. The herd was healthy. The addition to the house was finished and settled into and felt, by midsummer, like it had always been there. Thomas learned to say horse before virtually any other word, which both of his parents found entirely predictable. Ruth and Arthur Fielding were settled happily in town, and Arthur had turned out to be exactly as decent as his first impression suggested, thoughtful and steady, and genuinely amusing, and completely devoted to Ruth in the openly admiring way that made other men slightly self-conscious, and that Clara privately thought was exactly right. Ruth told Clara in July that she was expecting, and Clara embraced her again, less forcefully this time but no less sincerely. She continued to correspond with Alina in Springfield. The letters had become, over the years, an exchange between two women who had started as strangers connected by an extraordinary circumstance and had become, in some careful and genuine way, friends. Alina sent drawings that William made, wild, enthusiastic scrawls that were labeled in Alina's handwriting as "This is a horse," and "This is a dog," and "This is you," the last of which Clara kept in the drawer beside the photograph she had been able to look at for some time now. She sent back small things, a length of pretty ribbon, a pressed wildflower from the prairie, once a small embroidered handkerchief with a horse on it, because she had thought of the corral fence and the small host presenting his treasures, and she had wanted to send him something with a horse on it. She did not know what shape William's understanding of his situation would take as he grew older. That was a question for a later time, a conversation that would happen or not happen as the years determined. What she knew was that he was loved and well, and that she carried him with her always, and that Eli understood this and did not ask her to put it away. Pete Dawes announced in August that he was intending to retire at the end of the cattle season, which was such an enormous and genuinely surprising piece of news that Eli spent a full day in what Clara recognized as a state of suppressed shock before processing it. Pete had saved enough to buy a small house in town, he explained, and his knees were not what they had been, and he felt that 53 was a reasonable age to stop spending 14 hours a day on horseback. Eli accepted this with the dignity it deserved and spent the following weeks identifying whether any of the current hands had the capability to step up as foreman, which led to a series of evaluating conversations that Clara followed with interest from the other side of the supper table each evening. The hand he settled on was a young man named Samuel Bright, 24 years old, from a farming family in Missouri, who had been with the Anchor brand for 3 years and had the particular combination of practical skill and steady judgment that the work required. Samuel was quiet and earnest and took his new responsibilities with an almost touching seriousness, and Eli worked alongside him through the fall with the patience of a man who understood that the transfer of knowledge required time and could not be rushed. Pete's farewell supper was held at the ranch in late October, with all the hands present and Mrs. Hargrove producing enough food for twice the number of people, which was how she expressed affection. Pete ate 3 plates and made a short speech that was characteristically direct and unexpectedly moving, and at the end of it he looked at Clara and said, "You made him better, Mrs. Brand," which I did not think was strictly possible, but here we are, which she considered the finest compliment she had ever received in company. The winter of 1886 came in early and stayed late. the Kansas plains giving everything they had in the way of cold and wind. And there were weeks when the ranch felt very small against the enormity of the weather and the four of them. Clara, Eli, Thomas, and Mrs. Hargrove made a tight, warm world inside the limestone house with the fire going and lamps lit and Thomas demonstrating an opinion about everything at high volume. Clara discovered in November that she was expecting again, and the news arrived with the same complicated astonishment as the first time and also with considerably more ease because she was not frightened this time. She was simply glad. She told Eli on a Sunday evening, the same way she had told him the first time, sitting in the good chairs by the parlor fire, and he looked at her with the same expression, the contained and enormous joy, and said, "When?" "Summer," she said. "July, I think." He got up from his chair and came and sat beside her and put his arms around her, and they sat together by the fire while the wind did its work outside, and Thomas was asleep in his room and Mrs. Hargrove was in her quarters at the back of the house, and the whole world felt gathered close and full. "Eli," she said after a while, he said, "do you remember what you said to me that first time in the back room?" "About the jacket," he said. "No," she said, "the other thing, what you said about my past." He was quiet for a moment. "I said it stops here," he said. "Yes," she said. "Does it?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, not a test. She thought about it with the honesty it deserved. "Not exactly," she said. "It does not stop exactly. I think it comes with me, but it comes differently now. It does not have the same weight." She paused. "Because of you, because of Thomas. Because of what we built." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Good," he said. "That is what I meant. Not that it disappears, just that it does not have to define where you go from here." She leaned against him and looked at the fire. The weight she had carried since St. Louis, the layered, complicated shame, the grief, the careful architecture of survival had not disappeared because such things rarely disappear entirely. But it had changed its nature, had become something she carried rather than something that carried her, and there was all the difference in the world in that distinction. Their daughter was born in July 1887. On a hot afternoon when the prairie was at its most extravagant summer, the grasses golden and the sky an impossible blue, and she came into the world with a precision and an efficiency that seemed to suggest she had somewhere to be and was not planning to wait. Mrs. Hargrove received her with the same authoritative competence she brought to all crises, and Ruth, who had come out 3 days early again and who had her own daughter of 4 months on her hip, managed somehow to help and provide running commentary and keep Thomas from opening the bedroom door all at the same time. Clara held her and felt that enormous elation again, that complicated joy, and looked at a face that was her own face and Eli's face and something entirely its own, and thought of all the roads that had led to this exact room and this exact moment, and was grateful for all of them, including the ones that had been terrible. "What do we name her?" Eli said, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the small face with the same wonder he had brought to the first time. Clara had thought about this for months. "Agnes," she said. "Agnes Ruth Brand, her mother's name first, Ruth's name second." She looked at Eli to see if he would say anything about the choice of her mother's name, given everything. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly right," and leaned forward and kissed her forehead. She thought, not for the first time, that he was extraordinarily good at knowing what a thing meant. Ruth, hearing her name from the doorway, made a sound that was probably meant to be dignified and was not at all. And Thomas, craning around her legs to see what was happening, announced, "Baby," with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this classification to become available. The years began to layer, the way good years do, each one distinguishable by its own particular things, but all of them belonging to the same ongoing story. Thomas grew into a boy who was exactly what his father's child should be: serious and patient and possessed of a dry humor that appeared at unexpected moments and reduced his mother to helpless laughter, and also, inevitably, obsessed with horses, which was perhaps more accurately described as an inheritance from both sides. Agnes grew into a child with strong opinions and no intention of keeping them private, and a gift for the needle and thread that she demonstrated by the age of 4, by attempting to sew her brother's boot to the floor of the barn, which was technically successful, if not the application her mother had intended to encourage. Eli built the ranch steadily and thoughtfully, expanding when expansion made sense and holding steady when it did not, maintaining the quality of the operation with the same careful attention he brought to everything. He was known throughout Caldwell County as a fair dealer and a solid man, which were the two things he would have wanted to be known as, and Clara knew, though he never said so, that being known that way meant more to him than any amount of acreage. Pete Dawes came for supper once a month, from his house in town, and sat at the kitchen table and gave opinions about everything and ate 3 plates of whatever Mrs. Hargrove had made, and was not retired in any meaningful sense since he still periodically appeared in the corrals giving advice to Samuel Bright, who had the wisdom to accept it graciously. Ruth and Arthur Fielding had a second child, a boy, and Ruth wrote a letter informing Clara of this that was so precisely Ruth funny and warm and unsentimental at the precise moment, when sentiment would have been the easy choice, that Clara kept it in the same drawer as the photograph and Aliner's drawings, and the small things she kept from the years of her life. She wrote to her mother through all of this, the letters going back and forth across the distance, building something that did not erase the original damage but grew over and around it, the way a tree grows over an old wound in the bark. She sent photographs when she could. A photographer came through Caldwell periodically, and she had pictures made of the children, of herself and Eli, of the ranch in its summer and winter aspects. She sent one in the autumn of 1889 of the 4 of them on the porch, Thomas 7 years old and formal about it, Agnes 2 and not interested in staying still, Eli with his hand on Clara's shoulder and Clara looking at the camera with an expression that was, she thought when she saw the finished photograph, simply and completely content. She sent 1 copy to her mother in St. Louis and 1 copy to Aliner in Springfield, and she thought when she sealed both envelopes about the different kinds of love that a single life could hold, how they did not compete with each other but simply existed in their different chambers, each one real, each one contributing something essential to the whole. Edmund Whitfield died in 1889 in the fall, and her mother wrote to tell her. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table in the way she always read important letters, sitting very still, and then she set it down and sat with it for a while. She did not grieve in the way she might have once expected to, but she felt something, a kind of closing, a door swinging shut on a room she had not entered in years. She wrote back to her mother a letter that was carefully honest about the complexity of what she felt and careful also to be kind, because her mother was a widow now, and that was a real thing regardless of anything else. Eli came in from the barn and found her at the table and sat down across from her, and she told him, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "How are you?" "I do not know exactly," she said. "I am all right. I think I had already grieved that relationship, and now I am simply noting the final closing of it." He nodded. "Will you go to St. Louis?" She considered it. "Not for this," she said. "I will write to my mother, but no." She paused. "I do not think my father would have wanted me there, and I am not going to perform grief I do not feel." "All right," he said without judgment, and got up to put the coffee on. She went to St. Louis once, in the spring of 1890, with the children and without Eli, who could not leave the ranch during the crucial spring season. She took the train, which Thomas found magnificent and Agnes found suspicious but ultimately acceptable. She went to the house on Mulberry Street where she had grown up, the house that was now only her mother's, and stood at the door with her 2 children and rang the bell. Her mother opened the door. She was older than the photographs suggested, older than the letters suggested, and she looked at Thomas and Agnes with an expression that Clara recognized as the same expression her mother had always used for the things she loved most in the world, a kind of concentrated stillness, as though she needed to hold very carefully to the moment. "Come in," Agnes Whitfield said, in a voice that had something trembling in it. "Please come in." Thomas was polite and attentive in the way of a child who has been raised to be polite to adults, and who is making an assessment of his own simultaneously. Agnes was entirely herself, which meant that within 20 minutes she had relocated her grandmother's best embroidery scissors to a location known only to Agnes, and had expressed opinions about the drapes, the cat, and the quality of the biscuits relative to Mrs. Hargrove's. Clara's mother looked at them across the afternoon with a love that was completely unguarded, the unself-conscious love of a grandmother, and it was, Clara thought, one of the most genuinely painful and genuinely healing things she had ever witnessed, and both of those things were true at the same time, and neither canceled the other out. That evening, after the children were asleep in the guest room, she and her mother sat in the parlor and talked until midnight, and it was the honest conversation they had needed to have and had been building toward for years. And at the end of it, they were not entirely healed. Healing is a longer process than a single conversation can accomplish. But they were further along, and the room between them was smaller than it had been, and that was real progress. Clara went back to Kansas with her children and her heart full of the particular complicated fullness of a person who has done a difficult right thing. And when the train pulled into Wichita, and she transferred to the stage to Caldwell and saw Eli waiting at the stop with the wagon, Thomas's immediate and extravagant delight at the sight of his father causing a commotion that other passengers had to navigate around. She thought that this, too, was what love was. Not only the quiet evenings and the perfect moments, but the particular gladness of returning to someone you have chosen. Eli helped Agnes down from the stage while Thomas talked at him without pause, and he looked over Agnes's head at Clara and she looked at him, and the message in that look was perfectly clear, and did not need any words at all. The spring of 1891 was one of those Kansas springs that remind you why people called the territory the heart of the country, generous and green and warm, with wildflowers across the open grass in colors that seemed almost theatrical in their abundance. Clara's garden, which she had expanded steadily over the years to include herbs and vegetables and several beds of flowers that served no agricultural purpose whatsoever and which Eli had built the beds for without comment, was doing excellently. She was 31 years old. She had been in Caldwell 9 years. She had been married to Eli Brand for 8. She had, in those 8 years, built something she had not known how to imagine when she had stepped off the stagecoach with her traveling bag, and her false name, and her very reasonable terror. On an evening in May, with the light golden and long and the children somewhere in the barn with Samuel Bright, who had the patience of a saint for small questions about horses, she and Eli sat on the porch, which had become their particular evening ritual, the way certain rituals do become permanent and beloved in a marriage that has gone on long enough to have traditions. She had a letter in her lap which she had read twice already. "Alina writes," she said. "How is William?" Eli said. He always asked. "He is 8, she said. "He is apparently the finest reader in his school, which the minister reports with considerable pride, and he has learned to ride." She paused. "Alina says he is curious about things, about where he came from. She says it in a very careful way because she is a careful woman, but I can read it." Eli was quiet for a moment. "What do you think you will do?" She had been thinking about this for the 2 days since the letter arrived. "I think," she said slowly, "that there will come a time when he deserves to know. Not everything, not all at once, not until he is old enough to understand what all of it means, but something true." She paused. "I do not know when that is, but I do not want to wait until he is grown and has built his whole understanding on something incomplete." "That is the right way to think about it," Eli said. "You would support that," she said, though she knew he would. He looked at her with the steady amber gaze that she had spent 9 years learning the full language of. "Clara," he said, in the voice that meant he was about to say something very simple and very true, "he is part of your life. He has always been part of your life. Everything that is part of your life is part of mine. Yes, I would support it." She looked at the prairie going golden in the evening light, the enormous sky beginning its evening sequence of colors, and she thought about what it meant to have been fully known by someone and fully chosen. She had thought once that those two things could not coexist, that the knowing would make the choosing impossible. She had been shown, daily and definitively, how wrong she had been. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "All of you, every part." Thomas came running from the barn at that moment with something important to report about a horse, and Agnes was not far behind him, and the evening dissolved into the cheerful chaos of children and supper, and the ordinary brilliant business of a family going about its life, and Clara moved through it with the ease of a woman who has found the place she belongs and settled into it completely. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she sat at her desk in the study and wrote 2 letters. One was to Alina, asking whether they might meet, sometime in the coming year, whether the minister and his wife might consider traveling to Kansas, or whether Clara might make the trip to Springfield with Eli, whether a meeting might be possible that would begin the careful, necessary process of William knowing something true about where he came from. The other letter was to her mother, telling her about the garden and the children, and a funny thing Thomas had said at breakfast, the kind of letter that is simply news between people who are glad to share it, and which is its own form of love, the ordinary, continued, chosen kind. She sealed both envelopes and set them on the corner of the desk where they would go out with tomorrow's post, and she went to bed where Eli was already asleep, breathing steadily in the dark. She lay down beside him and felt the solid, real warmth of him, and listened to the prairie wind around the corners of the limestone house, and thought, with the full and complicated gratitude of a woman who has been through the fire and come out the other side changed but not destroyed, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had arrived in Caldwell with a secret that had nearly unmade her. A man had looked at what she carried and said it stopped here, and meant it, not as a promise to erase what had happened, but as a promise to stand beside her on whatever ground the truth occupied. And she had learned, through the years of building and tending and sometimes repairing what they had made together, that the past did not stop, not exactly. It became part of the foundation, mixed in with everything else that had shaped her, neither erased nor dominant. What stopped was the shame. That was what he had promised her without using those words. The shame stopped, because she was known and she was loved, and those two things in the end were the only things that had ever had the power to free her. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and starry and indifferent in the way of great things. But inside the limestone house on the Eli Brand ranch, 12 miles east of Caldwell, the lamps burned low and warm, and 2 children slept, and a man breathed steadily in the dark, and Clara Brand, who had once been Clara Whitfield and then Clara Weston and now simply, permanently, gladly herself, closed her eyes and let herself be still.